what we wanted to do today was to have maybe a reflective discussion amongst the visiting school staff and also with Donald Bates from Uni Melbourne and Lab Architecture Studio, just about the overall theme of design methods. We've kind of had a few discussions already at the beginning of the workshop, and I'm sure that there's been many discussions going on amongst yourselves and also within your units. Okay, so just to let everyone introduce themselves. I think that's always the best way to begin these things. We just go around the room, or I'll start with myself. Geoff Tarko, I'm the visiting school director for the AA in Melbourne.
Pavel Hladik, ACOM Ocean.
I'm Gustav Düsing. I'm teaching at Braunschweig University and UDK and running my own practice called Gustav Düsing.
Brendon Carlin, I'm teaching a unit at the AA, Intermediate 6. Have a practice called Urban Systems in London, and I also direct another visiting school called Tropicality, which is in Vietnam this year.
Paul Loh, lecturers at the University of Melbourne.
Holger Kehne, I'm teaching in Hong Kong University, and I'm running partner in practice plasma studio.
I'm Nick Williams, partner at ARMA Architects, and have been at RMIT the last 4 years, and now sort of stepping into full-time practice.
And Donald Bates, I'm the Chair of Architectural Design here at the University of Melbourne and Director of Lab Architecture Studio.
Okay, all right. So we're going to try and keep the discussion to about an hour or less, just within that time limit, so that everyone can get back to production. But I was thinking that after 2 weeks of lectures and reviews of work and discussions in the tutorial setting, that it would be a good idea to reflect on some of the issues and scenarios that have been set out and arrived at over this 2.5 weeks so far. Some that you've spoken about, and others that have evolved out of a mixing of the staff of all of us within the design studio. We've had 4 lectures that point to very clear and strong methods of designing. We've had Holger's, which takes a very indexed approach to exploring and evolving geometry in relation to the human experience. Nick's, which offered a take on geometric optimization based on material logics and limitations. Gustav's, that took us on a journey of low-tech improvisation to a no-frills structural and spatial simplicity. And finally, Pavel, who took us on a deep journey through a typologically driven design process. And let's also not forget the 2 design units. Unit 1, that has set out the design problem of combining the social complexities of Melbourne's urban setting with a tensegrity structural system. And Unit 2, that took on the Melbourne city block and laneway system as a territory to rethink the program of an innovation precinct. Okay, so we've kind of had that kind of taking place within a kind of cloud of discussion. But I thought we'd bring it back and begin by asking the panel the question of what their view of on the methods that they use, their own design methods, and how they sit between the academy, the situation that you're in, and the profession which some of us are in, and also how their methods have evolved. So maybe we can begin. Don, can I hand over you for this one? Yeah, I think because I think we just need a bit more. We need a bit of new energy into the conversation.
All right. Okay, new energy from an old guy.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll speak a little bit from that position of being by far the oldest person in the room, and yet probably also in one sense one of the well, not the youngest, but young in terms of running a practice. Our office, Lab Architecture Studio, only started 20 years ago. So it started quite late, sort of in my lifetime, so to speak. In terms of, I guess one of the things I wanted to say relative to this issue of practice and types of practice and formulations or structures of practice is in that 22 year period, I think the thing that's now coming back to me the most is a question of for want of a better word, a question of ignorance. That is, how do you maintain ignorance in your practice. Because in effect, most strategies of education and most strategies of production are based on becoming not just competent, but expert or highly qualified. And the consequence of that is that you're less and less, unless you pay a kind of critical, you're able to establish a kind of critical dimension to your work, you become more and more ignorant or unaware of other possibilities. In other words, there's this kind of paradox that the work demands that you become really good at it, that you establish a practice, a kind of authorship of a way of working, a way of proceeding, in order to really sort of forge a direction. But the risk is that the better you are at it, the less you're open to doing something other than what you're already doing. And so I guess what I want to throw out on the table is the degree to which alternative practices are important because they're alternative, but at what point do they become mainstream and become, for all of their differences, just become another kind of quote-unquote straitjacket because of both familiarity, comfort, ability, and sort of ratification because of the quality of the production.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, what's interesting about that is that I would ask whether that has to do with, in what sense that relates to different components of practice. So on one hand, the tools, for instance. On the other hand, the questions that are being asked, maybe. And then on another hand, let's say, the language of the work itself, the language of the architecture somehow. Because I would say it's almost unavoidable in the tool and sort of practice area, potentially, to not sort of build up that almost intuitive or even very systematic type of working process. But then when you start to deal with questions that you actually ask when you go into a project, and potentially the types of language, material systems, fabrication systems, those are pretty, I mean, my own experience is kind of quite wide open a bit.
Do you think being involved in academia helps this relationship? Because in a way we are using, I mean, students' project is a field, you know, it's kind of a rich resource. Sometimes students don't see the potential of their own project, but as tutors, as educators, you kind of sort of tap into it. And inevitably it comes to your repertoire, whether it's language, whether it's tools, whether it's techniques. I mean, Holger, you were involved hugely in educations and practice at the same time in Hong Kong. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree that, and for me that's important that to remain kind of fresh. But at the same time, I really feel I feel quite happy that we actually develop gradually a bit of a level of competence in some things, and actually that expands a little bit the bandwidth of the practice in a way that we can actually do certain projects maybe that we're sort of repeating ourselves. I don't think that's a bad thing. But we can then kind of like give something back that has a certain control, a certain value. Meanwhile, we can still expand our, on the margins, let's say, we can still explore new realms. So we actually have it's not everything experimental, and I'm quite happy that sort of gradually diminishes, that we can focus on those projects and be very specific, like where do we want to explore and where do we just want to kind of, just now. But in other realms, we maybe just want to be kind of a bit more on the safe side, let's say, or be less explorative and more kind of producing things that are actually necessary. So if, oh my God, how do you turn this off actually?
No, the top button.
So in that sense, but that together with having an overall, let's say, somewhat a notion at least where things are going, and trying to kind of keep it all together, no? So that you're not kind of completely kind of losing yourself in within it, but there's some sort of relationship between the mainstream, let's say, and the more offbeat kind of outliers of practice, I think. And if that works, I don't know yet. We're sort of in the process of hopefully getting there. I think for me that's a pretty good kind of concept to work towards.
I mean, for me, there are two aspects to this. One, and I guess the reason I bring it up, one is kind of increasing frustration as a practicing architect of the demands that for you to gain a commission, you already have to have done something. You know, that EOIs and submissions for projects, you have to have said you've already done it before you can be on a short list in order to get to do it, which means that obviously, that means it starts to close the circle of people that are possible, you know, which is totally, you know, for me, it's a kind of decimation of a kind of ecology of design inputs and such. But the other thing that's interesting, and the reason I wanted to bring it up in this context, partly within the workshop itself, but also the kind of various practices that are on display here, is the role of what we would traditionally call research in practice. And I guess this is where, to some degree, it goes back to questions of academia as well. The degree to which, you know, projects, or within an office, you have a kind of quote-unquote research component and the practice or everyday component. And the degree to which the research component is there to provide answers to specific topics of a project, or the research component is there to keep providing not answers, but that might become answers. You know, it's just there to be stimulating, to challenge things, to ask another way of looking at something. And, you know, to a certain degree, how feasible is it for every office to, quote, have a research component, or is it only feasible for certain scales of offices? And, you know, part of that for me harks back to a kind of cycle that I would identify historically, where, you know, there were times when, quote, research, to my mind, and this is my reading of history, was most prevalent at the academy. Mm-hmm. So at the AA in the mid-70s to mid-80s, I think there was a lot of research, and a lot of those people then went on to establish practices. So if we talk about Zaha and Rem and Libeskind and Tschumi and Nigel Coates and, you know, Future Systems and so on and so forth, a lot of them were not building, or building very little when they were teaching, and they developed some techniques and ways of working and stuff. And then when they went into practice, they were not seen as architects. You know, someone like Bernard was seen as a, quote, a paper architect. And then he wins a competition, and then suddenly all that stuff starts happening. Then, you know, the rise of OMA and others, where they, and, you know, UN Studio, where they established, quote, research dimensions within the office. And then I would say by the sort of late 80s, early 90s, there was actually more interesting work being done in offices than necessarily in schools. Then, you know, there may be another cycle where things like the DRL and, you know, MTech and various other places around start to bring it back within the sort of academic sphere and then feeding out. And so I guess the question, I mean, for me, I think that's one of the interesting components of these AA visiting schools, is the degree to which they operate as a kind of disseminators of techniques and inquiries and research agendas, but while also providing experience and expertise that feeds back into diverse schools and diverse habitats, you might say.
Yeah, I think so. But the, in hearing, you know, just like recapping some of the things we've spoken about already, the kind of term that keeps on popping in my mind is this is resistance, which is the thing that we probably all struggle with, those of us that are in the academy, trying to resist the kind of structures of bureaucracy, but also in practice trying to resist the structures of commerce. You know, because in a way, we still need to bow down to them a bit in order to kind of take things forward. And I just was wondering if anyone else, or maybe Holger, you would agree with this, Nick as well, about is there a kind of conscious resistance to falling into certain patterns that maybe start talking about, you know, trying to avoid certain conventions, that maybe this is also could be a strategy in order to bring back maybe the ignorance that we kind of miss. You know, I think that's why we also like doing the work. I mean, I like doing the workshop. There's this moment of ignorance about how do you go through a process like this, and how do you begin to evolve it, and yeah, that's where things kind of come out.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we're trying to remain kind of critical, but it's we're also a little bit exceptional, no? In terms of scale, and in terms of kind of having a relatively global position and being quite academic, of course, as well, no? And relatively conceptual in our approach. And I wonder if there should be, in an ideal world, there shouldn't be these kind of distinctions. I think like that should be more of a permeability towards the right thing to come through, and ideas that really reflect the kind of like social conditions, or the things where the future is aiming at, or the patterns that we want to have around us. Let's say that they actually come to the fore, be this a more commercial practice, or or a more experimental one. I mean, there should be at least some sort of common ground there. But somehow it seems that, and I don't have that experience, that within certain kind of corporate practices or certain scales of operations as well, a lot of that somehow seems to be more difficult. Then again, there's the OMA. They're always like they're doing huge projects, a lot of projects, and they always find somehow a critical edge to it. No, but that's really a very rare exception. And yeah, I really wonder why, and I'm a little bit like ambivalent about that. Like, if we were to grow, like let's say we would get a bigger project or so, how to actually manage to retain who we are today.
Maybe Pavel.
Well,
yeah.
I would add something to the scale of the buildings, as I showed you in my presentation. Because we focus on certain type of buildings, and these are sport buildings, then we have the opportunity to basically get to the bottom of what is needed and what is the whole building about, and take it into certain parts and then do our own research. And as we are a quite small group within a big practice, we always tend to keep the same people on the certain type of the project. That means, for example, stadia. So then we go and try to improve ourselves. So we are learning from us, and we don't establish research as a completely different agenda. So basically, the execution of the research is every new project. And to keep us fresh, we would quite like to collaborate, because there are other practices, and they have different visions, and they have different procedures and different methods of design. So yeah, I agree that it has to do with scale, and yeah, in our case, it is about our focus.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that when you talk about it, I start to think what distinguishes research. I mean, almost how do you define research? Because actually, if you're kind of an inquisitive person, and if you, and I think now, especially now, we're constantly faced with new conditions all the time. So things change so fast now, and projects, the demands of projects are so different that I couldn't say that I'm ever not involved in research. I mean, it's just absolutely forced upon you as a kind of, you know, I guess inside of the world we operate in, it's quite tricky to say that you don't do research. I mean, there's a lot of difficult questions that come with architecture, and if you're not sort of recycling things, and if you are a young practice that has a connection to academia where you have students constantly coming in and bringing new ideas, bringing new tools to the conversation, then I feel like we're constantly trying to negotiate everything, and that forces us to be innovative somehow. Forces us to constantly change as well. And the questions, I mean, like I was saying earlier, I think the questions for me always change. I think you say resisting commercial interests somehow. I think there are larger kind of global tendencies, flows that for me, let's say over the last 4 or 5 years, have become a primary set of questions that drive the projects. So it's good to ask how you'd actually define research now. I don't know if it's the same thing as it was in the 70s. So.
Yeah, I mean, if I look around, I would say that's more the exception than the rule in the majority of practices. And I think, one of the conflicts, the sort of internal conflicts I have is the degree to which, I profess a huge interest in research and experimentation, but I know on a day-to-day basis in the office just trying to get work out, and it's very easy to say, well, we'll do that on the next project, or we'll see if we can get more in depth on the next time it comes up and such. So, I'm part of the reason for positing this is not really to try to establish any particular position, but I am interested relative to kind of new generation of young architects about how, what kind of office, what will the office be like in 15 years when these guys are all running their own offices or in charge of big offices? Will it be the same? Because I see, for me, there's an interesting, in Australia in particularly, and Melbourne is a kind of locus for that, I see the changes in the big corporate offices. So people like Hassel, people like Woods Bagot, in the last less than 15 years, but more than 10 years, so somewhere in the last 10, 15 years, have quite consciously changed the way their practices operate. So, for instance, I remember about, it's probably been years, not quite 10 years ago, Woods Bagot, which is one of the most corporate offices possible in the world and in Australia, published a little kind of newsletter, which was basically a kind of rip-off of a lot of work from OMA, MVRDV, BIG, and UN Studios. So it was kind of positing them as, we're doing this research, we're having people investigate this, which is not to say they're not. So it's in no way saying they're not doing that, but it was clear that they saw the need to represent themselves as being forward-thinking. It's interesting the degree to which graduates from the DRL, from Columbia, SciArc, get picked up now in order to refresh offices. Not just refresh them in terms of, historically, if you look at sort of corporate architecture internationally, there were the really solid schools, the Harvards, the Yales, the Columbias, the Berkeleys, whatever, that provided the kind of young corporate talent that would slowly work its way up. But I would say in the last 15 years, there's been this tendency to say, no, we want to bring in outside talent, not to work its way up, but to disrupt what we're already doing, because we're clearly not doing the stuff that's getting all the publicity, Either it's imagistic, or it's formal, or it's, programmatic in terms of its, difference, so to speak. And so they establish sort of, incubator groups whose sole purpose is to not do what they're already known to do. So, it goes, if you look at somebody like SOM, it went from being, there was an SOM style, to suddenly there are projects you go, is that really SOM? I could never imagine them doing that. Look at all those curves. Where did that come in, Or you go to KPF, or, there are a number of really corporate, and you clearly see they've injected some sort of virus
a bit of youth into it
to do something else.
A bit of that resistance.
So, Well, it's either that or it's just a good marketing strategy. You know, that
Yeah, I
says,
think
well,
it's more that.
that's what's selling, so we got to get on the bandwagon. Otherwise, we're not going to win any more competitions. You know.
Well, this is crazy because I was just in this ADAS office in Hong Kong, and there every building is kind of like another great sort of crazy design idea. But what does that actually leave the ground for a more kind of like progressive practice? You know? When they're actually doing all this kind of seeming, I mean, it's very superficial, right? But it is obviously done with the purpose of there is this continuity. They don't want to have anything disrupted in any means, but they just want to catch up with the market. And
Yeah.
the market forces within East Asia, they're changing, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a very cynical approach.
I think you just hit that right word, superficiality. I think research and academia tend to be deep, drilling deep as opposed to drilling wide. I think maybe that's where there's still mileage in academia. I'm just reflecting on what Donald was saying in the 70s, where a lot of experimentation, the avant-garde is within academia. And I was just kind of reflecting because Nick, Amma, and my own practice, Policymaker, is kind of probably where it was smaller, and we're deliberately very fringe, right? We have two houses, but we kind of work with materials, we work with experimentation, so it's no longer formalistic. We work with multi-tooling process in order to build up a language. I completely agree with what Brendon was saying. I think part of design, I think we deliberately leave the office very loose in terms of, well, here's are the tools. In terms of design methods, we're always searching for different design methodology. Almost every single project, perhaps different. We sometimes recycle, and I think all practices do that.
I mean, I think that, one of the, sorry to jump in, but in the back of my mind, relative to the audience that we have here is my advice to you would be, I think when people look to, once you graduate, you look to like, what am I going to do next? Where am I going to work? Where am I going to earn a living? Where am I going to, gain some experience and so on and so forth. I think on the one hand, there is, going to those offices or trying to get jobs in those offices that appeal to you because of the work they do, the kind of work they do, what it looks like, what the issues, the thematics are, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really valuable. And if it means taking on a job that doesn't pay very well, but you're quite clear what you're going to get out of it, then I think I'm all for it personally. But you can also, when you go to offices, pay attention to how the office is structured, because I don't think we talk enough about office structure as defining of what is also produced. So it's not just, well, we do this kind of curvy stuff, or we do all this scripting and we end up with this, but it's like, yeah, but how is the office actually structured? I mean, is there a single voice that's directing everybody, or are there captains who lead teams? How are the teams structured? Is there a standalone, separate, quote, research unit who's just trying stuff out and materials, and is the person you go to and say, well, I don't know what it is, but I want this stuff that'll do this on this side of the building, Because there are offices that have that, and there are others that, like Pavel was talking about, where there are teams that operate quite consistently, in order to be challenging some suppositions. So I think whenever, and to a certain degree, I think it's useful to spend the first 10, 15 years of your life working in lots of offices, so you get the exposure to different ways of doing it, not trying to settle in one for too long, A couple of years in a place is a good time to gain some experience. But because in a way, what you're building as a life is not just your signature from a design point of view, it's actually how you're going to operate. And so I think it's really important to understand that and understand the differences. And the only way to understand the differences is to participate in different situations where you're confronted with how work happens, how it's promoted, how it's understood, what are the dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics, and to what degree is it challenging conventions, or what degree is it just trying to float on the top of a wave that's moving in one direction?
Yeah,
talking about these kind of research departments in offices. I guess I was doing that for 3 years in an office, and it was interesting because there were situations where this unit that I was running kind of came into place and said, all right, we got that exhibition going. You have to maybe come up with something new that kind of reflects our practice in certain ways, but on the other hand, maybe frames it in a new way. And sometimes there was just very little time, so we had to kind of go and check the archives and maybe modify some things. And then other times we had quite some time and maybe some budget from outside that allowed us to develop something really new. And so it always came towards some sort of exhibition scale. Maybe there was kind of like fragments, artifacts, something that could be a facade or could be some structure. And some of it really went on to be a bigger exhibition or like an installation. Some of it just ended up in a kind of catalog as a picture, but you really never know because once in a while really there's this kind of, let's say, creative hole, let's say, in the competition team, and then these guys are just going and they're opening up the latest kind of research little folder, and then there's something that they can take onward. So in that practice it really was this kind of, there was one department producing constantly new stuff that sometimes wasn't really doing anything apart from being a geometry study, a material study. But there was these kind of moments where someone was saying, all right, this could really work in this case, and they were digging it out, and I think that was fair enough. It wasn't something that was particularly invented for a specific project, but suddenly things made sense, and then they got applied, and that really worked out a couple of times really well. Because there can be this kind of two brains. There can be the guys that are just doing competitions and they're working on the urban scale, and then there's a couple of guys who are working on small scale things that can also be really big things in the end. You don't know, and sometimes they communicate and then the project happens. Or we did this huge competition for a museum, and we came up with this roof structure, gigantic kind of curved loops. Competition didn't go anywhere, but it was still there. I mean, like, this is hot, you know, this is something. We have to develop it further. It can be an organizational system, can be a roof structure. And then we took that onward and we brought it into some sort of like fabrication research. We really did kind of CNC carving and did these frames in there, and then we made it an exhibition. And then that was it, really. We were like, okay, we pushed this really far, and it ended up in this exhibition with this kind of suspended ceiling and these drawings. But that's good, you know, we kind of recycled that from another project, but it actually made more sense in here.
Gustav, aren't you just really kind of talking about a particular design method within a practice?
Yeah,
there is a form of method, no?
Yeah, no, I
totally
agree.
Well, you know, you're talking about bricolage, bricolage, I think, no?
Yeah, it's kind of
referencing things in kind of multiple layers, multiple ways, and always moving laterally.
Yeah, there's two. Sorry. No, I was just going to say two really important examples, I think, of what I think you're getting at. Is that, and what's important for being strategic about how you organize an office. One is that when I was working in UN Studio, Ben basically implemented this system. First of all, he came out and he said, listen, I don't design anymore buildings. I design the office. So I design how people communicate with each other. I design how research is conducted. I structure the practice, and that's what leads to innovation, right? So what he did at the time is he set up 6 research groups that all would work in a different area of research, and you would subscribe to one of these research groups. You'd get half a day on Friday to work in the research group, and then every month you would present the research to the office. So that's one example. Let's say on the other end of the sort of ideological spectrum, Pier Vittorio Aureli is talking about how he likes to talk about technique and about how technique is the most important thing about practice. So technique all the way from questioning completely how an architect works through the whole process of making a building, right? So he talks about Carlos Scarpa, and he says, Carlos Scarpa, what he does is he doesn't design the building and then give it to a builder, have the builder go out on site and build the building. He says, okay, builder, let's go build a building, and he follows them to the site. I'm exaggerating a bit, but he follows them to the site, and as he starts working and designing, he starts giving over drawings. And as the thing evolves, he continues drawing as the building process is happening. which I think we also experienced in China a bit unintentionally, but he actually intended for that to happen. So you can see in his example, he totally shifts the way of working as an architect. And this is where innovation comes from somehow. I think you have to be really strategic about how you structure the practice, and that's a good example of what we do at the workshop. And what we're explaining is that, we don't design what you guys, we don't envision exactly what you guys would produce, but we do think, what components can we throw together? What kind of structure to the process can we give so that something innovative
In a way, we
happens?
already frame the research, we're gonna frame not necessarily the outcome, but we certainly frame, put a boundary around the agenda.
Yeah, the limitations.
The limitations, the possibilities as well, hopefully.
I guess the difference maybe between a commercial office that really produces a lot of buildings that may not be that inventive, and I'd say research-based practice is that in a research-based practice, the outcome of the project is unknown. They just all start from, we don't know where we're going to, and maybe the other side of the road is then the kind of practice where they already know, okay, we're gonna do this again, and we're gonna kind of retrofit it into some sort of specific situation. And I guess if the office really has that research thing going on, that kind of reflects into other parts of the office as well. So like a kind of research unit in an office can really kind of branch out the spirit to other departments, and it's always this open-end thing. So you try out a lot, and that makes maybe a research-based practice also quite inefficient, because things take longer, and you don't say, right, that's it now, you're going to do this now, you're going to keep on going, because this is what the nature of research is. You want to know, you want to learn, and that's why things take so long, and then it becomes really expensive in the end. It makes a good project.
I've been sitting here very quietly, kind of.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you what your opinion was on
I'm quite troubled by this notion of ignorance, because, I mean, maybe I've been an academic for 4 years, and I sort of think that what we should be doing is understanding problems deeply and starting to understand where the kind of fringes are, where kind of key opportunities exist to expand what's known. The role of the architect has always been, or has long been, one of a sort of generalist, and I think this is, I mean, there's so many forces around an architect that are sort of normative, and you sit down with a table of engineers who sort of say, right, these are our criteria we're going to work to, this is what our brief says, these are standards of practice. But the architect has to somehow know how to ask not ignorant questions, but that sort of work within, sort of prompt the engineer to kind of reframe their scope of operating. I found, okay, so some of the examples to try and make this a little bit less abstract. In field of acoustics and in fields of structures I've worked in recently, there's there are very, they sort of become these. The tendency is for standard solutions to slowly, or for certain practices to become normalized and become prescriptive solutions. So it's the role then of the architect to be able to say, I understand how that's come to be. However, before that, there were these different questions about, okay, so what, another example, I used to supervise aerospace engineering students at RMIT from time to time, which was a bit of a round thing, but they were very happy to have me on. And the one very easy question you can ask those guys is, so you've presented a whole series of criteria and where you're working to, where did those come from and why? So you've got to be able to understand things that drive those, but then be able to say, right, there's ways of understanding sound and space that aren't about reverberation time consistently, for example. So this question about diffusive spaces acoustically is one that's drawn a lot of differing opinions from acousticians, and I'm definitely not an acoustician, but we've been able to then prompt certain conversations, prompt an opening of little areas of research, and that's included a couple of ARC grants and that sort of thing, around what might be possible. So you sort of say, no, okay, we're not going to measure the space like this, we're going to ask a question about saying that there are phenomena that are more complex, and all we can start to do, we need to start to try and frame these differently. So that requires a certain expertise, a certain level of knowledge, and that's, one of my big problems, or one of my concerns about, this is a bit of a, jumping around a bit here, but one of my concerns is that, and one of the ways that ARMA is operating right now, is that we're picking up work that architects have done a certain amount of, and we do some projects from schematic design, but others we pick up where the architect actually hits a point where their modelling skills, their understanding of the fabrication process doesn't work. And we say that there's this tendency for architects to become less and less involved through the building process. Mm-hmm. So somehow this notion of I think architects have to sell themselves on providing an expertise, providing kind of mature questions somehow around what's possible.
No, I understand that.
Say, okay, there are these client or whatever. There are these opportunities that these guys are just ignoring because what they do on the day-to-day kind of ignores them. Let's try and tackle one of those.
Yeah, but I think for me there are, I think what you tell clients isn't necessarily what you believe, or the truth. I mean, in the sense that, it's clearly. I mean, and it's one of the things that frustrates me a lot. That increasingly all the mechanisms of sort of institutional commissioning are more and more about, well, we can only hire somebody who's already done it already. We can only hire somebody who's done it 10 times already. We can only hire somebody who's got an office of a certain size because, we need to do this. And, it's all about trying to guarantee. And then the last thing, I mean, I understand the need or the sensibility of wanting to guarantee life, but, guarantee is a good way to die. I mean, that's all it does. It's just, it's guarantee that's the one thing that's going to happen. But so, from a kind of corporate and institutional point of view, the idea of being able to say, yes, we have this experience, we have this competence, we've done this before, we've got this, those are real stories, but they're stories, because I think what it takes internally within the operation of an office or a practice, I think is, I mean, in a way, when I was listening to you talk about the architect instructing the acoustician, was actually supporting my position, which is it's because we don't know about the science of acoustics, we say, well, what if we did this?
Yeah.
Why can't we try it this way? Or what would it take to make it work this way? As opposed to falling back on the inherent knowledge based on a disciplinary precept or something like that. So, I think
the risk is to be part of that conversation for any sort of duration and sort of evolve that conversation somewhere. You've got to have a certain amount of.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be smart enough. I mean, ignorance is, from my mind, the notion of ignorance is not stupidity, and it's not lack of knowledge. It's about unfamiliarity and a lack of comfort. So the point, it's like, for me, the best example is when you go to a new city. You're not stupid, you don't suddenly lose your brain capacity when you go to a new city, but you're ignorant of the city. You walk into it, you don't understand the patterns of life, you don't understand the relationships, everything is fresh, everything is at the same register. You haven't started calibrating, because knowledge is about positioning and calibrating and giving hierarchy and classification to the world. So, because if every day you walk down the street, you saw everything as if it was brand new, you just go crazy after a while. I mean, that is part of, sort of a kind of pathological condition of everything means everything all the time. So we need to establish patterns and rhythms and relationships and so on and so forth. But in so doing, we stop paying attention to certain things. And we only pay attention to the exception, to the moment when somebody runs down the street with a gun, and suddenly that's unusual. And we didn't notice before there was a green door over there until we try to remember what happened or something. So for me, ignorance is an active condition. You have to actively become ignorant, because most of your life you're too smart. I mean, you're you're too experienced. So it's not a difference between smartness or intelligence, it's a difference between experience and innocence, or experience and ignorance, you know. So it's how, in a day-to-day practice, how in the very midst of conventional repetition and order, do you find a mechanism that makes you innocent again, if only momentarily, in order to see a process and a project and a situation in a means that was always there but was in fact invisible to you because it's assumed by knowledge and experience.
Yeah, sometimes that happens when you're becoming thrown out of guard, when you actually have a very kind of conceptual setup or a technique that actually is outside of your own kind of like willful control system, that requires a certain kind of operations that are a bit contradictory, or or this kind of unfamiliar situation becomes kind of nurtured by that. That's why I think usually these things go a little bit hand in hand. That by designing something in kind of formally, let's say, it's not like lots of people take that formal as something superficial, but actually that formal is maybe the instigator for other kind of means, for other questions and other configurations that then actually have a much deeper meaning. So in that sense, I always think like the project should come into their own sort of like by themselves in a way, and in that sense they can actually then encourage new affiliations, and suddenly we see something new evolve.
In a way that in academia, you know,
No,
learning, teaching, students learning is actually a really good example, because to be honest, most students tend to be very brave. They put all faith in the tutors to believe that they will get something back right, and I think that faith, or that sense of control, lack of control over their project, having 3-4 voices simultaneously talking to you at the same time, and you have to make a decision. And I think that process of learning is what, I guess, as practitioner, we should always try to bring back, maybe.
So it needs to oscillate, no? That at some point you need to claim,
Yeah,
sure.
you need to really kind of like see, okay, and then you have to say, well, now I want to kind of like pull it out of here, out of this kind of pool of uncertainty and tons of options, and then and then you have to decide which option it is, right? And that's that process actually is equally important. So I think it's this oscillation really. You want to always wear a different hat as well, look at the same problem from a different direction and question it, but then also you somehow not always come up with a completely different outcome every time again. No, there needs to be some consistency as well.
So I think one really interesting way to negotiate what you guys were just talking about is that you can, there's a saying, the more you know, the less you know, right? And this is something I've experienced very firsthand, that the more research I do and the more heavily I get into specific research, the more I go into a place where almost what I would call ignorance. It's sort of a place where the sort of my categorizations of the world have slipped away, or they've dissolved into something else. I mean, I've seen that they were a kind of illusion, and then the space of the sort of possibility has opened up in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's I mean, it's quite so what I'm getting at is that actually sometimes, you know, aside from the example of you go to a new city and obviously you don't know the context well enough to sort of develop the same or fall back on the same kind of categorizations that people that know the city well will. So I can come to Melbourne and say, oh well, I think, you know, this place is a sort of archive of stylistic periods and it's really fascinating, etc. And you guys are like, well, actually, no, you don't know what's going on here. No, but actually, it can lead to a really interesting conversation, an interesting project. But also, if you look at a topic intensively, very intensively, and you go into the layers of questions that surround that topic, you'll probably get to a place where also all of your categorizations that you typically have held fall away somehow.
I think there's a third component to that as well. So I mean, I think you're right. I think on the one hand, you know, what I would consider this sort of theme of ignorance comes out of unfamiliarity, discomfort, not being aware of the structures, the inherent structures and stuff. The second is, as you said, I mean, you know, the more you look in, not always, but a lot of times the more you look into something and you get deeper, it both branches off, but it also exposes beyond the kind of conventional layer that you thought that's what it was about to understand. I think there's a third, which is a much more, again, a kind of active process-based operation, which I would call or term a kind of process of evacuation, which means you have to consciously get rid of your first-order responses. And the best example I have of that is through literature. There's a group, primarily in France, not exclusively French, but a literary group called Oulipo.
Yeah.
And one of the main writers in the group is Georges Perec, and he wrote a great series of novels. One's called Life, User's Guide, which is about apartment building, fantastic book. But all of these writers included Matteo Calvino and Harry Matthews and Raymond Queneau and a bunch of other people. They tended to use structure to develop their projects. So as opposed to this idea of creativity and pure freedom where you just take a blank sheet of paper and somehow you have a kind of stimulation and something just flows from your pen and you write this great novel just out of your pure genius or something. Instead, they would give themselves tasks. So Georges Perec wrote this one novel in French where he set himself the task of writing the novel without the letter E anywhere in the novel. So no words that use the letter E, which in French is really hard because there's a lot more E's in French in words than in English, for instance, or German or something. And what's significant about that is not just as a kind of exercise, but what it meant was that every time he wanted to say something, a certain percentage of the French language was not available to him. So he had to rethink and rework his relationship to the language to still, quote, say what he wanted to say, but not say it with the way he would have had to say it normally. And so it's a kind of evacuation. It's kind of like,
Purging.
yeah, purging yourself. It's it's a course of it's a kind of homeopathic tradition of eating things that eliminate everything from your body, so you can detox in a certain way. But I think that has relevance in architecture. That when you're doing, and I think this is where iteration and sort of serial processes become really useful. So the first few times you do something, you do what you were going to do before you started. Before somebody said, oh, design a bedroom, it's like you already have 5 ways you're going to design it. And you have to do those and then throw them away so that you can then do the 6th or the 10th or the 21st way, where you're no longer relying on the way you would normally do it. So again, for me, that's a much more active, so it's ignorance based on elimination. You have to get rid of what is at the top level of your responses in order to begin to bring up responses that are not based on just kind of easy answers you can do out.
That should sound familiar to the students of the workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to, we're kind of at an hour, but I wanted to kind of offer some time for the students to ask any questions and also partake in some of the discussion. Is there any questions? No?
You just want to get back to work.
You just want to get back to purging things? Yeah?
Yeah, starting a project's afresh.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Like when you talk about jumping to office to get more experience, but then like how does the firm see you as like, okay, I'm going to have you for a couple of years and then you're going to jump again? It's like, how much knowledge am I going to give it to you and how much work am I going to give you to do? That's not, that kind of like the NEPA. Like,
Well, let's put it this way. Have they guaranteed you 5 years of work?
Well, depends on how long the project runs.
Yeah, but have they guaranteed they will keep you for 5 years?
I suppose like when you started.
I don't know any office in the world that'll guarantee you a job for 5 years.
No.
So why should you guarantee them?
One for that one.
All I'm saying is that, yes, of course, you know, you go into an office, they've hired you, they give you some responsibility, you work on a project. Of course, you have to treat them respectfully. But remember, they're using you as labor. If they lose 2 projects, you could be out the door next week. So you have to also think about, you know, your life. I mean, you know, they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because it's a commercial relationship. So you have to also think about it as a commercial relationship. Like, what am I getting out of it? What am I gaining from this? It's not just that they're paying me a salary that I can live on. It's what am I, you know, that's where you have to think of working in offices as part of a long-term strategy. It's not just, oh, thank God I got a job, now I can pay my rent. That's important, absolutely. But you also have to think, well, how is this advancing me? What am I getting out of this? And you have to, I think, pay attention to what's going on, you know, around you. Like, you know, like I said, how is the office structured? But, you know, how do they assign projects? How do they deal with projects? How do they deal with clients, you know? Even if you're not in on all the meetings, just see, how do they come in the front door? How do they project themselves, you know? Who are the clients? Are they people they went to school with? Are they because they're on boards of directors of the gallery or the museum, and there's where they're meeting all the, you know, people with a lot of money? I mean, just, you kind of have to, I think, you know, we tend to put huge focus on kind of the design moment, the moment of design. And we should. I think it's radically important compared to other disciplines. But the learning of architecture is more than just that moment as well. It's, you know, it's how do you get a client? How do you keep a client? How do you disseminate your work? How do you bring collaborators in? How do you operate for a long term, you know, for a short term, and so on and so forth. So it's just to say that I'm only saying this because I didn't do this. I wasn't smart about it, you know. And, you know, I never, you know, I thought, oh, you know, it's good to be loyal and stick with one person, and, you know, and they were nice to me. It's not like they were bad, but it's like, I wished I'd gone and worked in such and such. I could have figured out how they do that. I wished I'd have paid attention to how they set up their library. You know, I wished I'd have figured out what their filing system is like. Because when then I did start an office, and we got a big project like Federation Square, it's like, oh, fuck, what are we gonna do now? We've never done any of this. You know, so that's the other side of it. And we were, you know, in one way we were, well, I wouldn't say we were unlucky, but we were necessarily, because we weren't based in Melbourne when we won the competition, we had to form a joint venture with a local practice, and we formed one with Bates Smart, which is one of the big corporate practices here. And so we stole all of their systems, because we didn't have any, you know, we just, you know, all the projects we did would fit in 2 folders, and then, you know, with Federation Square, we had like 500 folders at the end of the project, and if we hadn't had a kind of document management system, we you know, who knows where we would be. So, you know, I mean, this is being crass, but I think you know, you do respect the people that hire you, but you also need to be thinking about what you're getting out of it, you know, and where do you want to take it, and if necessary, move on to somebody else to get a different kind of experience in order to be able to compare it. I mean, I'm really strong. I mean, another reason for doing iteration and doing sort of serial work is comparative analysis. I think it's really important that you have, you know, if you do one thing, it's an exception. If you do 2 things, it's a coincidence. If you do 3 things, it starts to form a pattern. Once you've done 10 or 20 or 100, then you can understand differential relationships. And then you can start to make, as Holger was saying, then you start to make real decisions. Because at the end of the day, one of the primary activities of an architect is making a decision. It's this and not that. It's that material and not this one. It's this way to spatially organize and not that way. But as opposed to treating it as an act of imagination and creativity and inspiration, I think you have to build up a body where you can make clear, robust decisions based on relationships between alternatives. I have a badge, sorry.
No.
I have a badge. There was an exhibition in Sydney of the artist Chuck Close. Do you know Chuck
Yeah.
Close? He does these sort of photorealistic images, but when you get up close, they're all done by little pixels of paint or even so. And they were handing out, or they weren't handing out, you had to buy them, but they had these badges at the gallery that I bought, and he has this thing, that says, inspiration is for amateurs. Because it's only amateurs that believe in inspiration. Working artists believe in work. It's not inspiration. It's, this the smallest thing you have to worry
There's
about.
a good book on that topic called The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield, you know this book? Really,
No, it's all right. I think we need to end it. Yep.
I've got one more question.
Okay, last question.
Back to the topic about corporate architecture, and architecture is kind of a research and one that has more meaning, right? So, as a young practice, just starting off, where do you draw that line? Of course, you need to get sort of work in to run your office, but then where do you draw the line between a project that's pretty much run by very very developer driven, just out there to make cash, and another project that's about the meaning, the deeper meaning to it that has
I mean, practices have to draw their own lines. It's you have to make decisions. I mean, there's points where you're not doing everything you want to be doing from the start. So you either got to so either I'm going to draw an income from teaching, or I'm going to do other things. But that's up to practitioners to make those sorts of decisions. I think collaborative groups can try and
But I've seen a lot of my peers and colleagues kind of like going further down the line of like just compromising, and it's very difficult to come out of there again. It
Yeah.
seems. And we've been actually equally silly, but somehow it's okay because it's who you are. Like really rejecting some projects where you think this is just not us, right?
It sets you up for future clients, because the clients see the work you've done, and then they ask you to do, they say, oh, that's what you do. Okay, well, do me one of those, right? So if you're constantly compromising and that's what you show, naturally they want that from you as well to some degree, unless they're very, very open-minded.
I think also if you get started, you may not have as much projects, so that you have more time to really go deep into the projects you have, and so actually that may fade out at one point, because you will have lots of projects, and then you won't find the time to really spend time on researching and like developing projects from like a blank piece of paper. So I guess the very beginning is very important to also think back to your study time and take these kind of design methods that you learned there and really put them in practice, because the more you do it, the more you kind of end up in a routine, I guess.
But why would you view practice as something outside of it just being another design project? Yeah? You can create your own practice, you can create your own terms, you can set up your own systems that also incorporate the knowledge you gain from kind of coming across those types of scenarios. Yeah? And there is a lot to be learned in stumbling and failing with a client, and also the struggle of trying to find out what is your practice. What, doesn't need to always follow the same model. And I'm sure if you went around the table, every single kind of version, and there's different versions here, there's different scales, different targets, different ways that you design how you approach and deal with your clients. Also, how do you design how you get the clients that you want? Yeah? They're just, in a way, you just need to view them as problems that have a kind of serial approach. Yeah, the next client, the next client, the next project, the next competition. Some succeed, some fail. Maybe they do both at the same time.
But I think, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but my sense in your question was also what I would call the sort of McDonald's equation. It's like, where do you spend your time and effort? Do you work someplace where, you know, all of your hours are so confiscated that you don't have time to think beyond what the office is doing? Or is it better to get a job at McDonald's, earn enough money to live, and then you do competitions, or you do research, or you develop other kind of things? So, you know, it depends. You know, out of this room, you know, and this is not a hierarchy of quality or qualification or anything, but, you know, if there end up being 5 really important architects that come out of it, that's a huge number, you know. And that's not because anybody failed, it's just because it's hard. You know, it's hard to both have a living wage and keep pushing against boundaries and stuff. It's just a lot easier to have people tell you what to do and you do it. You know, it's real easy. You know, that's what McDonald's is great. They just tell you what to do. You just do it, flip the burgers, and, you know, you get paid, you know.
So, you know what, I mean,
But
Roland does this for students at RMIT in second year. Some of them just turn around and go, "Why are you here?" I mean, honestly, this is not an easy job. This is not straightforward. If the kind of things you seem to be looking for.
But it's
Well,
also
yeah,
okay. I mean, I think
I
it's
don't know if that
perfectly
gets asked here.
legitimate to work at a corporate office doing second-rate work in order to get a living wage to then do stuff on the side that you really believe in, and build it up and gain experience and gain opportunities and submit for competitions and go to lectures and participate in workshops and go out and look at the world and be really engaged and interested, and it'll turn into something.
So there's the double whammy story of like Ma Yao-song, no, who works at Zaha during the day, and that means that you work from 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. and then he and the other partners go to a flat in London at 2 a.m. and they work until 6, 7 a.m. designing for competitions. So sleeping a few hours a day, this kind of situation, and they win absolute towers in Toronto, right, and then start their office. You can also be insane and cut your life down by 5-10 years by doing what most of us have probably done at some point. Burn the candle things.
All right. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.